Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great day. This is going to be the Chapter 12 lecture recording on the central nervous system. So let's hop right into it. The first part we're going to talk about here is the anatomy of the central nervous system, too. So looking at the brain. So all the different regions of the brain. First, we'll start it with development. So looking at how the brain folds upon itself and forms the different regions. And then we're going to look at the different regions of the cerebral hemispheres, and then diving into the diencephalon, which is a different part of the brain, then the brainstem, the cerebellum, and then these functional brain systems and how they work together. Later on in the lecture, we're going to talk about higher mental functions, how the brain is protected. So the brain, if it could crush under its own weight. So it sits in the cerebral spinal fluid and kind of floats in that. And there are these different layers called dura mater, which protect it. So we're going to go into that too. And then, of course, we have to look at when things go wrong, concussions and things like that. Then the next part, we're going to look at the spinal cord as part of the central nervous system. So there, looking at the spinal cord, we're going to look at stuff travels, not stuff, but signals travel up and down the spinal cord. And then that leads us into the next chapter, which is on the peripheral nervous system. So a good little heavy chapter here to start us out. So now the development of the brain or a brain region is called cephalization. So CEPH is a root word for a cluster of neurons. So we could see this in a flatworm here. There's a cerebral ganglion, which is an early sign of cephalization. So this is typically on the rostral or anterior portion of the central nervous system. It's just this cluster, which becomes this integration center for the whole system. So then the development of our central nervous system resulted in an increased number of neurons, and the highest level that we know of is reached in the human brain. Now, how does this all develop from an embryological state? Your brain is very interesting because it's all these folds that fold upon itself. So there's a bunch of surface area and these ridges and grooves in your brain. So how does it get to that final shape? So in these next couple images, pay attention to the different colors here. So we have the green region, the more red region here, the purple region, and then the, I guess, tan region. So there's these different flexures, these different curves as the brain forms. And we're going to follow these as we go. Now, these primary vesicles all get some special names. So this prosencephalon, the mesencephalon, and the rhombencephalon. These relate to the forebrain, which is the one in front, the midbrain, and the hindbrain, the one in the back. So this is at week 5. We all look like this. So these two little flexures form here between the midbrain and the cervical region. So again, right here's the spinal cord, and these little flexures form. The key here is we want to watch this. As we develop, this actually comes up and wraps around. I know I'm drawing in the highlighter. I could switch to the pen, but I guess I'm being lazy. So let's see how this changes as we move through. Again, this is week 5 here, and this is just talking about the telencephalon is this forebrain region, and then the diencephalon is right back here. Those are two of the key parts here that we want to watch. So the hindbrain then separates into the metencephalon and myencephalon as we go through development. So that telencephalon ends up being your left and right cerebral hemispheres, which we'll talk more about later. But here it shows that wrapping mechanism as it wraps around. And this is that increasing of the surface area of your brain. So then we see the green region end up here. That red region ends up becoming the cerebellum, which is that part on the back of your brain. And then the diencephalon becomes the center of your brain. So it becomes the epithalamus, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and also the retina, which is part of your eyes. So these little pockets coming out right here end up becoming your retina, which is pretty cool. And then the mesencephalon back here remains the midbrain. The midbrain is where the pons, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata are. And then there's a central cavity in there that forms the ventricles or the spaces in your brain. So then the brain grows faster than the surrounding skull. And if you notice, babies have a very large head compared to the rest of the body. It's pretty much to fit this brain. And that's one unique thing with humans. So here it's talking about how the forebrain moves up and around and wraps the diencephalon. It goes all the way back to the midbrain here. So it doubles back and envelops the diencephalon and midbrain while creasing and folding to increase the surface area. So a very, very important part during our development here. So now we can start getting into the adult brain. So this is the final um, bending of the cerebral hemisphere around, wrapping this region here. So we break it up into these regions. There's a cerebral hemisphere. That's the main outside of the brain that you see. And then there's a diencephalon, which is deep inside. We talked about what just makes it up. We'll go through those different regions as well. Then there's the brain stem, which makes up the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And then there's the cerebellum back here. So all the important parts, we're going to go through these step by step now. Next important thing is to understand communication distance in the brain. So last chapter, we talked about gray matter versus white matter, or myelinated fibers versus non-myelinated fibers. Remember, if it's non-myelinated, this would be the gray matter, short fibers, and they're only communicating over short distances. So when we look at different sections of the brain, we're going to see varying amounts of gray matter and white matter. So if you see an area that has a lot of white matter, you know that's myelinated, and that's actually why it appears white. So that's going to be in areas where there is long distance communication. So now I'll show this next on the pictures here for all these little features and changes of pattern, but here is the words that summarize that. But here, looking at the different sections, let's start down here in the midsection of the spinal cord. And this is a typical representation of a spinal cord. We have all the white matter surrounding a region of gray matter in the middle. So let me change to the pen here. So if you're a signal coming in, this is where a signal comes in, it goes through an interneuron in here in the gray matter. It's a short one. Whereas this neuron coming in can go all the way down to your fingertips. Then it does a signal in here, and then it can send a signal out this way. So this is the typical division, and we're going to talk about this pathway of the afferent pathway and the efferent pathway. And then here's the little integration center, and then it could also jump to the other side and then come out this side. So it can send communication to the other parts. Then you have the white matter in the middle here. So this interneuron could jump to white matter out here and then send that signal up to the higher brain center. So it can send long distance travel up to the brain, or if it needs to send a signal lower, it can. So there are ascending and descending regions within the spinal cord too. And that's why understanding the different regions of white versus gray matter are very important. Then as we move up through the brain here, we could see how this gray matter starts shifting into these different nuclei that we start finding in the brainstem then. So when we get to the brain, we find these regions, these pockets of cell bodies, and they're called nuclei. And we could see these right here, the gray matter in here, these gray matter nuclei. So when we have communications coming through here, the white matter is actually long distance communication, but little signals can interact here with this gray matter and modify that. So we're going to talk about that when we talk about these are called the basal ganglia in here. And then there are spaces in the brain. These are called the ventricles. And then if we're looking here, the cerebral cortex has gray matter on the outside. So these are little neurons sending signals. Whereas the white matter in the brain, these are all long distance. So we're going to talk about how it could travel across the brain from one part of the cerebral hemisphere to the other, or out. So different communication networks that we can find throughout the brain. So again, pictures, and even if you dissect a brain, you can see these different regions of gray and white matter. So just understand that that represents myelinated versus non-myelinated fibers. And now we can start focusing on the cerebral hemispheres here. So this is 83% of the brain mass are these cerebral hemispheres. Now there are some important lobes in the cerebral hemisphere. And if you remember the skeletal system, these lobes are the easiest thing you can ever think about. Frontal lobe is right next to the frontal bone. Parietal lobe, right next to the parietal bone. Occipital lobe, occipital bone. Temporal lobe, temporal bone. So everything comes together. Only new things you're going to have to remember are the cerebellum back here and the brainstem coming out the bottom. Those aren't technically part of the cerebral hemispheres, though. There are some other regions that make up the brain that are important too. These gyri are the ridges we find here. So if you look at a brain, there's these ridges and these valleys. So these little valleys or shallow grooves are known as a sulci or a sulcus. And then fissures are deep ones. So we have this very deep fissure going down the middle. So that's a longitudinal fissure right here. And then there's the transverse fissure, a deeper fissure over here, separating the cerebellum from the hemispheres. So important parts of you see on a brain here. So here is showing the different sulci and how they relate to the different lobes. There's a nice color-coded brain in the classroom that I want to make sure you all look at that shows these different regions. It'll help you for the practical part of this exam then too. So the frontal one, of course, the frontal lobe, parietal, here for the parietal lobe. Now there is a little sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. I'm not sure why that highlighter jutted out there like that, but this little central sulcus right here, and depending on how good the brain model is, depends on how well you can see that. But if I were to label a region, I'd make it really, really clear of where that label was. And then back here, you have the occipital lobe, and then the temporal lobe is right here by the temporal bone. There's one new one here. It's called the insula. You can only see the insula if you separate the temporal from the frontal and the parietal right here. It's a little deep to both of them, but it's still considered part of the cerebral hemispheres. And this is also showing the difference between a fissure is a deep sulcus, and then a sulcus is shallow. And also remember, gray matter is all on the outside, and then white matter beneath it. And now we could start talking a little bit more detail about those hemispheres. So we have that gray matter superficially on the outside, and then right internal to that, we have white matter. So we can start thinking about how this communication is happening. And then, like I said earlier, we have those basal nuclei within the white matter. So nuclei are clusters of cell bodies of the neurons. So the cerebral cortex is known as the executive suite of the brain. Every motor function, sensory input is all being analyzed in the cerebral cortex. We're going to talk about the different regions in the cerebral cortex and the importance of what happens in each of those regions. So this is the site of your conscious mind: awareness, sensory perception, voluntary motor initiation, communication, memory storage, and understanding. So very, very important region. But even within this, there's a whole bunch of different things going on. And that gray matter layer is also where we find all those cell bodies, dendrites, glial cells, blood vessels, but no axons because it's gray matter. And then this accounts for 40% of your brain mass, so quite a bit. So how do we know where different things happen in the brain? We can look at imaging. So this is called functional imaging. Or you can use PET scans or MRI using different magnetic resonance or radioactive dyes. And you have the person, hey, can you use your vision? Which region of the brain is activated? Or hearing, we see that's in the temporal lobe. So when we're showing, or when I'm showing you all the maps of the brain and where we know different associations happen, where different things are processed, this is from doing studies like this, finding which regions of the brain are most active when you're doing those events. So there are some higher functions that form multimodal association areas where you're like thinking, you're forming multiple associations. So this is you when you're taking the exam here, you're, forming connections from you heard this information. So you have an association area of where you heard it. So that's summating. You maybe were speaking when you were studying, so you're forming that association. Then you were reading, you were touching, multimodal association. Then for that final output of you getting that answer correct on the exam is what it comes down to. So this is you on exam day. And when this happens, your mind is insert animation. We'll let that play. Sorry, I had to figure out a way to throw in the mind explosion while talking about the central nervous system. All right, now let's go back to talking about the cerebral cortex here. So each region has a motor area, a sensory area, and association area. So what do these all mean? Let me switch the highlighter here so I'm not covering everything up. Motor one, controlling motor output. If I had my cam on right now, you would see me moving, doing a motor output. Then during all this, you're always being consciously aware of your surroundings. And then, like I talked about just for this thinking, you have all these association areas. So you're combining these associations to memories and so forth. So when you see a skunk, you form a memory association with skunks can make me smell bad. So you know to stay away. So that's a way of integrating this diverse information. Another unique thing about the brain is that each hemisphere is concerned with the opposite side of the body. So your right brain controls your left side, which is pretty neat. And then there's some specialization. Not left side of the brain does not equal right side of the brain. So we'll talk about that later as well. So things like writing, speech, being musically, inclined, and things like that. And then conscious behavior is the entire cortex. So then this is a good outline of all the regions of the brain. So I'll spend some time here, but we're going to go through all these different regions. So starting here at the central sulcus, this separates, remember, the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So first going forward here, we have the motor areas. This red region here is the motor area, or the primary motor cortex. Then there's a premotor cortex in front of it, and then a frontal eye field, which is controlling your eye movement. And then we'll talk about some of these other areas up to here, like the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area, which is right over here. So we'll talk about those later. They're involved with speaking and also analyzing speech and forming words. Then in the frontal lobe, so this is mostly frontal lobe up here. So working memory for spatial tasks, executive area for task management, solving complex multitask problems, personality is part of the frontal lobe, and then also memory is an important part up here. And then we go posterior to the central sulcus, so back here to the parietal, down to the occipital. So these are then sensory areas. So up here is mostly motor and analysis. Back here then is having those senses coming in. So here, this is somatic sensation. Somatic sensation is what your muscles or what you can actually perceive come in. So somatosensory cortex and somatosensory association area. So we'll talk more about that coming up later. And then you have to analyze taste. That happens in your gustatory center of your insula. Then back on the occipital lobe, that's for vision. Vision, primary visual cortex, and the visual association area. Then hearing is on your temporal lobe, so the auditory association area and the primary auditory cortex are all there. All right, first here, we're going to talk about the motor areas in that primary motor cortex, which is what's known as in the precentral gyrus. In the premotor cortex, Broca's area is for speech, and then the frontal eye field as well. So here, the primary motor cortex, again, outlined in red right here, located right in front of that central sulcus. Now, in this region, we have a special type of neuron called pyramidal cells. These are large neurons that allow conscious control of precise, skilled skeletal muscle movements. So think of the motor ones. Now, this isn't the only part of your brain that controls muscle movements. So this just sends the signal out that says, okay, you're contracting your biceps. There are a lot of other association areas that control then how powerful or how fine-tuned that contraction is. So we're going to add more things to this, but this is where it initiates. So it starts here and works its way down. Then these pyramidal or corticospinal tracts are then formed from long axons that then project down the spinal cord for that movement. Now, one unique thing about the brain that I find really cool is this term called somatotopy. This is where all muscles of the body can be mapped to an area on the primary motor cortex. So if you've ever been to carnivals or fairs or anything like that, or even Disney, there's always someone there that draws a caricature of you. So these motor homunculi are these caricatures of your motor cortex. There's also one for your sensory cortex. So now, if you look at this, that's what this is showing over here. So the different sizes are representing the amount of motor output. So look how much motor output you have just to control your face. So it's a very, very large region of this primary motor cortex. Remember, it separates left and right side here, and that's what this is showing in red and blue, and how this differs as we move down through. So this image down here is showing both motor and sensory. So you can see there's a lot of sensory input for your face, hands, and so forth. Then we move forward from that primary motor cortex to the premotor cortex. So this one helps plan more skilled movements. Like I said, we're going to start adding onto that motor output and fine-tuning it. Because how does someone, shoot a basketball and hit that three-pointer every, compared to someone who doesn't practice? Why can that person who practiced shooting that basketball be so good at it? It's all about training this motor output and planning these skilled movements. And part of this is the premotor cortex. We're going to also talk about how the cerebellum plays a role in this as well. So here, this premotor cortex works for controls learned, repetitious, or patterned motor skills. So it coordinates simultaneous or sequential actions as well, things like walking or and whatnot. They become reflex arcs which keep firing, so you don't really have to think about doing it. So this controls voluntary actions that depend on sensory feedback from the environment. And then the Broca's area here, this is the one for motor speech. So it directs the muscles of speech production. If my Broca's area didn't work well, my tongue wouldn't be moving properly right now, and you guys would not be able to understand anything going on in this lecture, even if you're kind of lost right now to begin with. So if you are lost right now, you can pause this video, take a break, and come back and restart it. My Broca's area is still working though, so that's not the reason. So here, we'll be talking more about the Broca's area and how it relates to the Wernicke's area as well. Then we have the frontal eye field. Your eyes are hopefully watching this. If not, you're just listening to my soothing voice. But if your eyes are watching this lecture, you are controlling your voluntary eye movements. You're moving them left and right. You're probably multitasking right now if you have multiple monitors looking somewhere else, but your frontal eye field is what is coordinating those muscle movements of your eye. So it controls voluntary eye movements. Yes, you looking away and texting right now is a voluntary eye movement, meaning you can decide not to do it. Or you can pause the video, text, and then restart it. I think that's the best idea. Okay, now we move a little into the brain, going more deep here. We can add some more parts. So we get to the sensory areas back here. So we see the somatosensory cortex. So we can see how deep this primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, and the frontal eye field are up here. And then back here now we have the somatosensory cortex. Back here on the parietal lobe, the somatosensory association area just posterior to that, and then we get to vision back here. So I just wanted to show this as an intro to the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex, because we have the primary somatosensory cortex, the somatosensory association cortex, the visual areas, the auditory areas, the vestibular cortex. So the vestibular cortex is for balance. Then we also have the gustatory cortex for taste, and then the visceral sensory area. So visceral is for organs. So that's organ sense. So they're not all listed right here, but we will go through some of them. So here, these are the sensory areas we're going to go through. So this is all conscious awareness of sensation. So this occurs in many lobes of your cerebral cortex, your parietal, insular, temporal, and occipital. So hopping right into it now. So working our way posteriorly, starting with the primary somatosensory cortex. So right behind the central sulcus right here is where this starts. And this receives sensory input from your skin and proprioceptors, which are stretch receptors of skeletal muscles, joints, and tendons. So now this is also doing spatial discrimination. So you can know the body region which is being stimulated, which is an important part. So I can monitor that and make sure you're not overstretching or anything like that. And then it does the same thing here, that homunculus upside down characters represent the contralateral sensory input from body regions like I showed earlier. And then here, the association cortex is then forming associations. So it integrates sensory input from the primary somatosensory cortex for understanding of object. So determine size, texture, and relationship of parts of object being felt. So let's imagine I'm touching a pen. Now imagine if you've never seen a pen before in your life. You would have no idea that object is a pen. But when you touch that pen, you have a somatosensory association cortex that says that's a memory of what a pen feels like. So your primary somatosensory cortex is just receiving that input. The association cortex is then like, oh, I felt this before. This is a pen. So that's what the easiest way I like to describe this relationship. And then our visual areas. So the primary visual cortex, this receives visual input from the retina. So whatever you're seeing right now on this screen is being analyzed back there. And then around that, so this is right on the back of the occipital lobe. And then beside that, we have the secondary visual area, or the visual association areas surrounding that primary visual area. And then this is then bringing in past experiences to that interpretation. So color, form, or movement. So ability to recognize faces. You can, if you have a problem recognizing people when you meet them again, blame your secondary visual area. But you still have that situation where it's like, oh, I've seen this person's face. I know them, but you forget their name. That deals with other areas then. And that isn't part of long-term memory in repetition. So the easiest way to learn someone's names is by repeating and saying their names. And now, if there is damage to this visual association area, you can't process vision, and that makes it so you can't see, even though vision is going to the primary visual area. So this is complex processing that involves the entire posterior half of the cerebral hemispheres. Then we get to hearing, which is the auditory area. So just like the other regions we talked about, there's a primary auditory cortex, which interprets pitch, loudness, and location. When we talk about the special senses, we'll talk more about how each of these are analyzed and how you can determine that. And then the association areas are then, just like the other spots, storing memories of sounds and permits the perception of sound stimulus. So that's where you're forming these associations. So when you hear a car horn going off, you know it's just an annoying sound, and very rarely is it actually someone breaking into a car. But you're able to analyze that sound, and you know it's a car horn. Whereas if you had no idea what that siren was, or think about a tornado siren. If you've ever lived in an area with a lot of tornadoes, a town has a giant tornado siren that would go off. Imagine if you had no idea what that siren meant. You would walk outside wondering what was going on. But you know not to do that because your auditory association area stored that memory. And then your vestibular cortex, so your vestibule, is part for balance and your position of your head in space. So we'll talk more about that once we get to the special senses chapter as well. One of my favorite chapters in A&P. It's just so cool how all this is analyzed and what you're doing right now, and you have no idea how much processing is going on inside your brain. And then olfactory is smell. So this is the medial aspect of the temporal lobes, and so part of the rhinencephalon. So if you have rhinitis, it's an inflammation in the nasal cavity. Rhinoplasty is plastic surgery for the nose, or nose surgery. So this is this rhine word. So this is in conscious awareness of odors, which we'll also talk about in that special senses chapter. So in gustatory, same thing here. This one is taste. So there's smell, taste, balance, vision are all part of our special senses. And then the visceral sensory area, this is for organs. So the conscious perceptions of visual sensations such as an upset stomach or full bladder. So this is what tells you, oh, I have to go to the bathroom. And then we have what are known as multimodal association areas. We've talked about these so far. It just gets a fancy word where all these areas are being associated together. So multiple outputs, multiple inputs, and they just get some different terminology. There's an anterior association area, which is on the anterior side. There's a limbic association area, which is on the anterior side of the temporal lobe. And then there's a posterior association area, which is more on the posterior side. So now, a little bit more about these. So these are tying lots of memories and lots of emotions into one output. So there's anterior association area, which is in blue up here, also called the prefrontal cortex, if you've heard that terminology before. So involved with intellect, cognition, recall, and personality. So there was a story, what's his name? Phineas Gage, who got a steel rod through his frontal lobe. He survived, but his personality changed drastically. He was a completely different person after the injury because of the damage he got to his frontal lobe. So, and also he lost a lot of memories from it as well. So this contains a working memory need for abstract ideas, judgment, reasoning, persistence, and planning. So look up that Gage story. I should have included a picture of it here, but I forgot. So this development requires feedback from the social environment. And then the orange area here, or the posterior area, plays a role in recognizing patterns and faces and localizing us in space. So written and spoken language, so being able to read and whatnot. This is called the Wernicke's area as part of this association. And then the limbic association area, which is the green area here, involves something known as the cingulate gyrus and the parahippocampal gyrus and the hippocampus. So this provides an emotional impact that makes a certain scene important to us and helps establish memory. So I always explain this one as, thinking back to working in our basement woodshop with my father. So it's a very good memory, and this is part of my limbic association area. So whenever I see a woodshop, I think of that memory, and it makes me happy. Or even if I smell sawdust, it activates that memory. So what I talked about earlier, this lateralization feature. So lateralization is how we separate labor between left and right. So hemispheres are not identical. So here, handedness is one big thing. So most of us are right-handed. So 90% of humans have left-sided dominance. So if you're left side dominant, you are right-handed. So this usually results in right-handedness. However, 10%, the rules can be reversed, and that usually leads to a left-handed person. But here are things like musical ability, some understanding language, mathematical ability, writing, motor speech. There's a separation of things in the brain, but there is still communication back and forth here. And that communication is what we're going to start talking about when we talk about these cerebral hemispheres and this difference in the white and gray matter. So this little connection between the left and right side is called the corpus callosum. All right, I'm going to take a sip of water here quick and then get into the next part where we talk about that communication. Alrighty, so we talked about the gray matter being on the outside and the white matter being on this side, on the inside. Now we can form these different fiber tracks for these communication networks. So the first ones here are these association fibers. Association fibers are horizontal. Commissural fibers are horizontal fibers that connect two hemispheres. These associations are in the same hemisphere. And this will be much easier to show when I show the next image here. And then projection fibers, think of them as projecting. They're vertical ones that travel a longer distance. So they form this compact band, and they also radiate through the cerebral white matter through the cortex known as the corona radiata. Okay, so this is what I wanted to show. This is the easiest way to see this feature here. So first ones are the association fibers in, I guess, red here. These are associations within the hemisphere. So we see these connecting different regions of the cerebral cortex, but staying on the same side. Commissural fibers, like in the spinal cord, we have this region called the gray commissure. The gray commissure is where you communicate left and right. So here, this commissure connects left and right hemispheres. For some reason, added a big blob in there. And then projection fibers project down through the spinal cord. They can also communicate with these little nuclei. So here we can start talking about these basal nuclei or these ganglia. So there are three main ones we have in this region of the brain. There's the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. These little nuclei that can form associations and monitor this longer duration output here. So some of these projection fibers interact with these nuclei and can then change the signal for the out. So we're going to talk about the importance of these. So you can see those little darkened gray matter areas in here that represent these little nuclei that can interact with these projection fibers as they move out. And also here, it all depends on the aspect of the brain you're looking at too. So here, these little association ones are looking like this. The commissural ones are going through this corpus callosum right here. So corpus callosum is what connects left and right hemispheres. And then here you can see these radiative ones coming down through here. So remember, these nuclei kind of wrap around the brain. This is a slice. So it's hard to, so these nuclei are actually pretty large in the middle there. So now these ganglia, here is the picture I wanted to show. So they're all known as the striatum Well, two of them, the caudate nucleus and the putamen, are known as the striatum. And this is big round structure, or this oblong looking structure. So it's not just like a ball. It's this elongated structure that goes through the whole brain. Remember that section we looked at was a slice there. Again, it added this random line. Not sure what's going on. So this is what that slice is showing here. So you're seeing the cross section of it. But remember, it wraps around. So what do these do? So these influence muscle movement. So fine tuning that muscle movement. And we're going to talk about a disease where these are affected. So Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease affect these basal ganglia. So they're disorders of basal ganglia. So Parkinson's is the shaking, and that's when these basal ganglia are firing uncontrollably, causing that shaking in the muscles. So there you can see how they control that motor output. So these also play a role in cognition and emotion, and they're also regulating intensity, slow and stereotyped movements, and filter out incorrect and inappropriate responses too. So they're helping you decide, what to say in certain situations, and then also inhibit movement you shouldn't be doing. So Parkinson's is also related to dopamine, and so we might talk about that a little bit more in class then. So then we get to the diencephalon. So this makes up the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So if we're looking at where they are, this egg-shaped structure in the middle, this is the thalamus. It's a major, major integration center in the brain. Now, this is one time the word epi doesn't seem like it's the correct word. But right here we have the epithalamus. Epi typically means upon. So if you read epithalamus, you're thinking it's upon the thalamus. It's actually just posterior and a little below it. So yeah, it should be called the infrathalamus. I don't know. This is the one naming one that didn't make sense to me. And then over here, and same here with hypo. This one makes a little more sense. Hypo, below. So below the thalamus, right here is the hypothalamus. This also connects via the infundibulum. That's the stalk right here, to the pituitary gland, which is a major, major hormone gland. And on the epithalamus, we have the pineal gland, which we'll talk about later as well. It releases melatonin, which is responsible for sleep. Hopefully you're not doing that by this point in the lecture. Not blame your pineal gland. So the thalamus here, again, it's that egg-shaped nuclei. A whole bunch of little nuclei that make it up. Same with the hypothalamus. And these are connected via interthalamic adhesion. So if we go back here, this little center bulb is called the interthalamic adhesion, which connects it. So bilateral nuclei, meaning there are two. They connect the left and the right side. So several nuclei here, they're named for the location, and then the receiving fibers from the cerebral cortex. So the thalamus is a major, major integration area. So it's a relay station for information coming to the cortex. So it sorts, edits, and relays ascending inputs such as impulses from the hypothalamus, so emotion and visceral function, organ function, impulses from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei for motor activity, and then memory and senses. So the thalamus is a major, major integration area. So overall, it acts to mediate sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal, learning, and memory. Now, the hypothalamus. So this is located just below, hence hypo, and then it's connected to the pituitary via the infundibulum. One of my favorite words. Sorry, I always love saying that one. So this does a lot. So the hypothalamus, when you have a fever, there's a spot in your hypothalamus which is regulating your body's thermostat. So there's a lot of autonomic system activity via your hypothalamus. So controls autonomic nervous system. So blood pressure. Oops, I lost my highlighter here. So blood pressure, rate and force of heartbeat, digestive tract mobility. So parasympathetic, sympathetic responses in your immune system. And this also initiates physical response and emotions, so perceives pleasure, fear, rage, biological rhythms, and sex drive. Important part of that sex drive part is this connection to the pituitary gland, and this is where the important hormones like FSH and LH are released for estrogen and testosterone production. Now, interestingly, this is right at the bottom of the hypothalamus is a region known as the optic chiasm or optic chiasma. This is actually where your optic nerve from your retinas cross and then go to different sides of the brain. We'll talk about this more in the special senses chapter when we talk about vision. But when I talk about that, I'll talk about this nucleus here called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. So there's a little nerve that comes up here to the SCN, and it helps regulate your sleep cycle. So your suprachiasmatic nucleus, so supra, above, the chiasma, and it's a nucleus. So that's where it gets its name, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Don't think of it as this long, difficult word. So here, the suprachiasmatic nucleus is helping regulate your biological rhythm over here. So it's just neat how we can see this optic chiasma here. Then we see this word, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So some of these words in anatomy are nice, even though they don't look nice at the start. And like the supraoptic nucleus, again, related to the optic nerve. Now you don't have to know all the different nuclei in the hypothalamus or anything like that. Just understand that there's a lot there. So like I said earlier, it also regulates body temperature. So sweating and shivering is your body's thermostat. So when you get an infection, there are these things called interleukins, which go to your hypothalamus and say, okay, my body temp needs to be now 100.4 degrees. So then you initiate the shivering response, which warms up your body. And then your body's like, okay, let's bring that temperature back down. I need to be at 98 degrees again. So then it initiates the response, and that's when you start sweating. And that's why when you have fevers, you have your shivering and sweating, and it's a mix back and forth. So you can blame your hypothalamus for that. Also, if you're hungry, this is regulated through here. So it's all about the different hormone levels in the blood and what you need. And if you're thirsty, it also helps regulate water balance via the kidneys. And then here's that SCN, or suprachiasmatic nucleus, sets our biological clock. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the endocrine system functions involved with that anterior and posterior pituitary glands. So lots and lots of hormones. You guys are going to hate. And actually, you'll love the endocrine system chapter later in the semester. Not yet. And then the epithalamus. The main thing about the epithalamus is that pineal gland, or the pineal body. This releases melatonin. Melatonin is then what helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle. Now, if any of you do take melatonin, only take it if a doctor tells you to. You can really mess with your sleep-wake cycle if you're taking melatonin on your own. You should only have to take it if you are having deficits with it, because if you start taking melatonin, your pineal gland will be like, oh, I don't need to release melatonin anymore. So then it will screw up the feedback mechanism for natural melatonin release. And also remember, melatonin is not melanin. This mistake happens a lot. Melanin is what causes skin pigment color and hair color. Melatonin regulates sleep-wake cycle. So make sure a difference between melanin and melatonin. I never said that before, and then I realized I should start reminding people after seeing that mistake happen a few times. Okay, almost through this little section here. We need to talk about the brainstem, which is made up of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. I don't know if you all saw Waterboy, but if you remember the medulla oblongata from that, that's how whenever I say medulla oblongata, I think Waterboy. You know, alligators are angry because they got all those teeth and they ain't got no toothbrush, but really it's because they have an enlarged medulla oblongata. I've actually never fact-checked that. I just know it's the quote from the movie. And then he yells, "No, Colonel Sanders, you're wrong," and then screams and tackles him and then makes the football team. That's how life works. But I do not know if alligators actually have an enlarged medulla oblongata, and that makes them angrier. I don't think the medulla oblongata regulates anger and emotions like that. That's more frontal lobe stuff. But anyway, continuing on here. Enough about Waterboy. So again, this then joins down and becomes the spinal cord here. So the rounded part, if you're looking at the brain model, there's a little rounded projection looking at the side. That is the pons. So right there's the pons. Midbrain is just above it here. And then right below the pons is the medulla oblongata. Both these have a bunch of nuclei in them for a lot of regulatory centers. So these controls automatic behaviors necessary for survival, which is why any injury to the midbrain or the brainstem here is very significant. So something as simple as breathing rate. You have the respiratory ganglion that are in the midbrain and the pons, and they're the major controls of breathing. So if those don't work, you no longer autonomically control breathing, which isn't a good thing. These nuclei are also associated with 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that we'll talk about next chapter. So all these little nerve fibers coming out here are the cranial nerves that you guys will eventually hate. I mean, love. So first here, the midbrain is held up by these cerebral peduncles, two ventral bulges that contain these pyramidal motor tracts, and they form pillars that hold up the cerebrum. So right here, these little peduncles right there that hold it up. So right superior to the pons. And then there's a cerebral aqueduct, this little channel that runs through it back here. So there's a channel running through the midbrain that connects third and fourth ventricles. We'll eventually talk about the cerebral spinal fluid formation. So it needs to move through these aqueducts and the channels to get nutrients throughout the brain. And then there's also the periaqueductal gray matter. So these nuclei play a role in pain suppression and the flight or flight response. So these really, really quick reaction centers here that are associated with different regions of the brain for that fight or flight response. Then we have the pons, and then this is another association center. These longitudinal fibers connect higher brain centers and the spinal cord, and these relay impulses between the motor cortex and the cerebellum. Lots of stuff happens in the pons. There's lots of nuclei there, but it's a major association center as well. We'll be talking about the pons when we talk about other chapters in A&P, so I won't dwell on it too much right now. And then the medulla oblongata, everyone's favorite part, is where it blends into the spinal cord at that foramen magnum. This also contains the choroid plexus, which is what is producing cerebral spinal fluid. We'll talk about that when we get to brain protection. And here, it's very autonomic and interacts with the hypothalamus. This is where we have the respiratory centers, like I just mentioned about, so controlling rate and depth of breathing, and also the cardiovascular center, so adjusting vasomotor, so whether you're vasodilated or vasoconstricted for blood pressure, blood volume, and the cardiac center, those cardioacceleratory centers and cardioinhibitory centers for increasing and decreasing your heart rate. And then there are also some other centers here for regulating vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, and sneezing. Then we finally get to the cerebellum, and there's this part in the cerebellum called the arbor vitae, which literally means tree of life. Kind of cool because it looks like a tree. Your cerebellum looks like a big bush. So this is 11% of your brain mass. So it processes input from the brainstem to provide precise, coordinated movements of skeletal muscles. So like I was talking about for basketball players, this training of the cerebellar cortex or cerebellum here is very important part of it. So including the basal nuclei, all of them need to be integrated and trained. So they play a role in thinking, language, and emotion as well, and it helps keep you balanced. So here, how it fine-tunes motor activity, it receives impulses from the cerebral cortex to initiate that muscle contraction. So it says, okay, we're going to contract the muscle. Then it receives signals from those stretch receptors in the visual. So how are we going to react to what the muscles feel right now? And then the cerebellar cortex calculates the best way to smoothly coordinate the muscle contraction. So this sends the blueprint to this motor cortex and the brainstem nuclei, and then it's outputted. So kind of cool how it's all linked and processed together for just, something as simple as, say, you're picking up an aluminum can or soda can. If you squeeze that can too strong or too hard, you'll crush it. So you have fine-tuned motor activity in order to pick up that can. And if that wasn't working properly, you would crush the can or not be able to pick it up. So then within the brain, we also have what are called functional brain systems. So here, this is called the limbic system and the reticular formation system, or RAS neurons. So here, this is showing the RAS, or the reticular activating system. And all this is here, these sensory inputs come in. So multiple projections of where these sensory inputs could go. And then these relay all through the thalamus here. Remember that thalamus is the major integration center. And then this continuous stream of, so your eyes have been open all this time with this continuous stream of sensory stimuli that keeps this cerebrum aroused and alert. This is known as the reticular activating system. And then the limbic system, this is part of the emotional or affective brain. So there's a lot of limbic system studies for this process. So the amygdaloid body recognizes angry, fearful facial expressions. So if someone has a very angry face, you know that could be something dangerous. And this is what your amygdaloid body is analyzing. And that's very important in relation to memory and these different associations. And then the cingulate gyrus, this plays a role in expressing emotions via gestures and resolves mental conflict as well. So when you're processing information in your brain, that's your cingulate gyrus at work. So this puts emotional responses to odors as well. I was talking about skunks earlier. So you know skunks smell bad because of the associations within your limbic system. And then most of these outputs are relayed via the hypothalamus, all those nuclei in the hypothalamus, and it interacts with the prefrontal lobes as well. So aware of emotional richness in our lives. And that's why there's a lot of study for the limbic system, especially in terms of like mental health and whatnot. The hippocampus then, and the amygdaloid body also play a role in memory. And I know everyone wants to learn the ways to enhance memory formation, and we'll talk about that later. So the last part of this chapter is just a couple tables here to help you, summarize the different regions of the brain. So I'm not going to go through each of these again, but just kind of a summary of the first part of this chapter here. So talking about the gray matter, the basal ganglia, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata, the reticular formations, and the cerebellum. All right, so that was part A of the central nervous system. We'll be talking about part B next, but I'll give you a break for this one right now. All right, hope you all have a great day and see you in class.